Good news, everyone. Jeff Okudah will be back at some point early this season, and we'll talk exactly why this upcoming 2023 season is so important for Jeff Okudah, the player.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So welcome back to this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every single day. And of course, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, your very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, which is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Just go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL or enter the promo code LockedOnNFL for a Yeti style tumbler. You won't want to take your bird dogs off, we promise you. In today's episode, we also want to thank our people that listen to our show. God, good grief. Guys, thanks to all the everydayers that listen to the show. The first listen. So some weekends, guys, like I unplug, and then when we get back to doing the show, I'm just like, what am I doing here? But okay, make sure you follow in the footsteps of the everydayers by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to the podcast. So hopefully we'll get this show back on track. But today we'll talk a little bit about Jeff Okudah and the good news that we got, right? We got an update from Arthur Smith on Saturday after practice that they got some positive news on Jeff Okudah. He said Okudah will be back early this season dealing with that ankle injury. We did talk a little bit about this on Saturday's episode. So many of you might have missed that episode if you or like a lot of people that only listen to the podcast during the week when you're commuting to and from work. But we did an episode on Saturday, one extra this week, where we were joined by John Macri of Pro Football Focus, talked a lot about fantasy football. But we also talked about sort of how the Jeff Okudah injury could potentially impact the team and sort of who are going to be the players that fill his shoes. And as we saw on Saturday's practice, it continues to be Trey Flowers and Mike Hughes as the next men up, as it was on Friday's practice. So if you want to get more insight into those players and what I think, how the team adjusted it, go listen to that episode. Instead, today, we're going to talk more about how this injury specifically affects Jeff Okudah, the man and the player, right? Rather than the team, right? And we as fans tend to look at it from the team perspective because we have loyalty to the team and all that sort of stuff. But there is a often forgotten human element when it comes to these things. And one of the things I try to do from time to time is talk about, the players and that human element. And I'll certainly be working harder to do more of that on the podcast than just always automatically talking about it from the team's perspective. But, with Jeff Okudah, this was, as we discussed on the previous episode, like this is another setback in what has been, a lot of adversity that Jeff Okudah has dealt with in the NFL. And, I don't know enough about Jeff Okudah's personal life, but I just know on the football field, he had a lot of success. So it's probably easy for me to say that he probably didn't deal with that much adversity on the football field, given that type of success that he had at the collegiate level, coming out of Dallas, Texas area, 5-star recruit, goes to one of the top programs in the country in Ohio State, has a very successful career there at Ohio State and is a number 3 overall draft selection, which, again, I need to point out that's not common, right? Prior to Jeff Okudah being the number 3 overall selection in 2020, the last time a cornerback was taken in the top 3 in an NFL draft was 1997, right? When Sean Springs, another Ohio State cornerback, got taken that high. Now we've seen Derek Stingley go that high since then, but that's pretty special for a cornerback. That's, essentially historic when you talk about where he got drafted. But once he gets into the NFL, hamstring injuries kind of derailed the beginning of his rookie season. Then he gets on the field, doesn't play particularly well. Then he's hampered by shoulder injuries and a growing injury, ultimately shuts him down for that season. The coaching staff there, Matt Patricia, gets fired. A new regime comes in under Dan Campbell, right? Looks like he's working his way back, having a good summer. And then the season opener in 2021 tears his Achilles. He's done for the year. Right. Then he battles back last year, seems to do a good job, lands a starting job, but plays well early in the season. But it seemed like for whatever reason, he kind of got in the coaching staff's doghouse and he's benched by the end of the year. He gets traded to Atlanta for virtual pennies. And this is kind of the last opportunity that Jeff Okudah has to kind of be a starter in the NFL, the last good opportunity, we should say. Right. And it's not to say that the Falcons have given him anything. By all accounts, Jeff Okudah has played very well in the early part of camp before his injury, and certainly was a guy that was, earning his opportunity as a starter here. But it was very clear that the Falcons were like, we believe Jeff Okudah is our starter when they cut Casey Hayward, when they did not use that premium draft pick on a cornerback like so many people, myself included, earlier in the offseason were speculating that they would wind up doing, right? And that was because they had this belief in Jeff Okudah. And after the season, I don't know how many opportunities Jeff Okudah is going to have where a team is going to be like, he's our guy, he's our starter, and just basically, essentially, again, not saying anything's been given to him, but give him that opportunity, right? Because after the season, Jeff Okudah will be a free agent, didn't have his 5th-year option picked up because he was traded, right? There's literal money on the table, right? Like Terry Fontenot took Jeff Okudah into this meandering hallway in a back room in Flowery Branch, some secret room that Jeff Okudah had never seen before in the facility, unlocked the door, and there's a whole stack of money on a table in the middle of that room. It's like $12-14 million. And Terry Fontenot was like, hey, Jeff, that's your money. If you play well this year, that's going to be your money, right? And that's what's on the table for Jeff Okudah. Now, he's made a lot of money on his rookie contract, but now he potentially gets to set up himself and his family and all these other things for the rest of his life with the money that he potentially earns this year. And it may be that he'll never get an opportunity to earn that type of money, because when we're talking about the money he's type of earning, we're talking about high-end number 2 cornerback money, right? We're talking about what Jamel Dean signed with Tampa Bay, what James Bradbury's getting from Philadelphia, right? Because we're assuming that, AJ Terrell's going to get that number 1 cornerback money next year, which is potentially $20 million or more. And then Jeff Okudah is going to get that high-end number 2 money, which is potentially $13-14 million or more. So there's a lot of paths ahead for Jeff Okudah and how his career may go. And a lot of it hinges on this season and how well he plays when he comes back from this latest setback, right? But we're hoping that he comes back very strong, right? Because one path for Jeff Okudah is, he plays well down the stretch this season for however many games he plays this year. And the Falcons give him, take him back to that secret room that he's been trying to figure out where it is in the week since Terry Fontenot showed him that room. And, they give him all the money, and they're like, he goes on to have a lot of success here in Atlanta for many, many years to come. Right. And then there's another path and plenty of other paths beyond this other path. But, there's another path where he doesn't earn that money, and right, that room is locked forever. And the rest of his career, he's considered a journeyman. He's considered a bust. When people talk about Jeff Okudah, they don't talk about the 5-star recruit that was one of the highest rated recruits coming out of his local area at the time, many years ago. They talk about his name is associated with bust. His name is associated with failure. And we don't want that for Jeff Okudah, right? That wouldn't be fair to Jeff Okudah, given all the hard work, all the adversity that he's been forced to have to overcome. So we're rooting for Jeff Okudah, the player. This is a big year for him. And hopefully we get more good news as, things unfold when it comes to Jeff Okudah. But we'll continue today's episode talking more about what sort of timeline we can expect from Jeff Okudah recovering from this injury, as well as what the Falcons do, and especially that defensive line does, to sort of compensate for the absence of Jeff Okudah in the time that he is out of the lineup. But first, guys, I want to tell you that Bird Dogs is going to help you look good all summer long with their stretch khaki pants that are designed to fit slimmer and through the thigh and leg and give you that truly sculpted look. And they fit way better than regular shorts because Bird Dogs invented a cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki but stretches, so you get a slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. And they also have that anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long. With Bird Dogs, every day at the gym is going to be leg day. Or if maybe you're like me and you're not going to the gym as much as you should, my Bird Dogs came in handy a month or so ago when I was at the beach, forgot to pack my swim trunks, and I was able to, look good on the beach in the ocean with my Bird Dogs. And so however you want to wear them, whenever you want to wear them, try them for yourself by going to birddogs.com/lockedonnfl, and you'll get a free Yeti style tumbler with your order. That's birddogs.com/lockedonnfl for a free Yeti style tumbler. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off, we promise you. So let's get into speculation territory here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. And, we don't know the exact status or injury of Jeff Okudah, right? I believe it's a high ankle sprain. Again, that's just a guess here, purely speculative on my part. And we don't know how much time he's going to miss, but we assume some part of the regular season he'll miss based off of Arthur Smith's comments. And I'm going to assume that he'll be back week 4 for that London game against the Jacksonville Jaguars. But frankly, both of those expectations and that diagnosis, I'm completely pulling out of my butt, right? But unlike other people, when they start talking out of their butt, I try to be responsible, right? I try to bend over, spread my cheeks, and show you exactly where I'm pulling from my butt. And yes, did I use that extremely colorful metaphor about bending over and spreading my cheeks? Yes, I did, right? And now that I have your attention, and I have the attention of pretty much everybody else in the room that you're listening to this podcast with, when you decided today, you know what? I don't need to put in my headphones, because I'm sure Aaron's not going to say something completely inappropriate on today's episode. But of course, I'm going to surprise you on this illustrious podcast. But, getting back to the subject at hand, when it comes to those expectations with Jeff Okudah, high ankle sprain, week 4 return, I'm not married to those conclusions. We'll get more information as the summer unfolds, and we'll adjust accordingly. But, I don't know how much information we're going to get moving forward, because we know Arthur Smith tends to be cagey with injury information. But if it is a high ankle sprain, this is probably one instance where Arthur Smith isn't just being Arthur Smith by withholding information, because high ankle sprains are notorious for being kind of hard to predict when a player is going to recover from them, right? If you just Google high ankle sprain NFL recovery time, you're going to get a whole bunch of different results, right? Some are going to say 2 weeks, some are going to say 3 months, right? You're going to see 2 to 4 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks. This is all over the place. We know players have played on high ankle sprains. Patrick Mahomes did it this past year in the Chiefs Super Bowl run. We saw Roddy White do it, I guess less successfully, back in 2013 when he suffered an injury in training camp and played the early part of the season on a high ankle sprain. And then that led to that sort of compounded other injury issues that he wound up having with a hamstring and a knee, and it was just a whole thing that season. But, to me, the reason I pick week 4 is it's 8 weeks from now as I record this. And so it feels like we're covering all our bases on that. And again, we'll see if we have to adjust that timeline accordingly. But that's why I sort of bent over, spread my cheeks, and presented you with that number. But in the meantime, how do the Falcons adjust without Jeff Okudah in the lineup? And as we discussed on Saturday's episode, you feel a little bit better given the potential drop off from Jeff Okudah to his replacements in Trey Flowers, Mike Hughes, or whoever else replaces him, because of the better supporting cast the Falcons have beyond that cornerback position, especially when it comes to the pass rush as well as the safety play. And on that episode, we talked about how you're kind of hoping that you're getting the 2021 version of Fabian Moreau, which we here on this podcast thought was a solid league average starting cornerback. But in that year, in 2021, that type of play got exposed probably a little bit more, because you didn't have a pass. You had the worst pass rush in the NFL. You probably had one of the worst safety groups in the NFL. And hopefully that is not going to be the case this year for Trey Flowers, Mike Hughes, Clark Phillips, whoever winds up filling in Jeff Okudah's shoes in the meantime. And certainly, I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know, but we need the Falcons pass rush to step up anyway. And especially if Okudah does miss time, right? Because if we're assuming that, week 4 return for Jeff Okudah, that means he's going to miss the first 3 games of the season. That's against Carolina, Green Bay, and Detroit, right? And I think if the Falcons are going to win those games, the pass rush is going to be pivotal in all 3 of those games. You got 2 young, unproven quarterbacks in weeks 1 and 2, Bryce Young, Jordan Love, playing on the road here in Atlanta. The dome is going to be jumping. But, if you want to give those guys a rough go in those, early road games, you want the pass rush to be sort of the thing. And when you look at a team like Carolina, they have an up and coming young offensive line, but you want our veteran D line or whatever to basically say, yeah, you guys, and say the same thing to Bryce Young, you guys might be really good in 2 or 3 years, but you're not good yet. And we're going to take you behind the shed and we're going to beat you. And then you look at a team like Green Bay the following week where, when healthy, they have one of the best offensive lines in football. But the last couple of years, their problem has been they haven't been very healthy. And, presumably that they'll be relatively healthier in week 2 than they probably will be in week 12 this year. You still want this defensive line to be yeah, you used to have that reputation, but that reputation is not going to be the case anymore as one of the best O-lines in football when healthy, because we're also going to take you behind that shed and we're going to beat you. And then that's all to build up to the week 3 matchup where you may be facing one of the best offensive lines in football with the Detroit Lions, right? That if, Philadelphia's probably got the top spot as the best O-line in football, but I think I would probably put Detroit forward as the top, the front runner for the number 2 spot, right? I would put them over Kansas City or over Cleveland as potentially the second best offensive line in football. And certainly if the Falcons D-line can take those guys behind the shed and beat them, right? Like that's going to make you feel really good about how they're going to match up with some of the lesser offensive lines or some of the more questionable offensive lines that they face, after that point with teams like Jacksonville, who offensive line's a little shaky at this point in time. So that's kind of what you're looking for. And so you're really hoping that this Falcons defensive line and pass rush really sort of steps up this year. And certainly, if they can take care of business in those first couple of games, you feel really good about their ability to take care of business, for the remainder of the season. That's going to be a great litmus test to see how far this defense and how far this pass rush has come. If they can really give problems in those first 3 games, if and when, a player like Jeff Okudah is out in the lineup. So we'll see about that. We'll also wrap up today's episode talking more about Frank Darby, of all things, as well as some of those other players from that 2021 draft class that we kind of wrote off going into the summer. But apparently things are not quite dead with those guys, and we'll get into all of that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now that preseason games are upon us, we know that football season is right around the corner. It's about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you a chance to win all season long, because right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets back every time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win a Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets after every victory. You'll use bonus bets on spreads, player props, over-unders, and so much more. If you want to bet on the Falcons winning the Super Bowl, their odds are plus 5,500. That means if you bet $200 today on the Falcons to win the Super Bowl, you will win $11,000 should they wind up doing that. But not only that, winning at the end of the season, all season long, you'll be getting bonus bets every time the Falcons win this year. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and you'll start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. So let's wrap up today's Locked On Falcons talking about 4 players from that 2021 draft class that we, and I probably should use air quotes, we wrote off going into the summer. When I say we, I mean me, right? But, if you're an everydayer here on this podcast, you're in the same boat as me, as you plus me equals we. And shout out to the everydayers, guys. We'll have some great guests, as well as break down some of the joint practices later this week if you continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. But, those 4 draft picks from that 2021 draft class that we wrote off were 3rd round offensive lineman Jalen Mayfield, 4th round cornerback Darren Hall, 5th round edge rusher Ade Ogundeji, and 6th round wide receiver Frank Darby. And all those guys came into the summer, being basically considered on the roster bubble, right? And I think the main reasons we kind of wrote those guys off and why they were put on the roster bubble after, relatively bigger things were expected from those guys a year ago is because those guys didn't make the year 2 jumps that we were hoping for last year. Right now, some of that's owed to injury, some of that's owed to other factors and whatever, but we talk a lot about year 2 jumps on this podcast. And it's because most of the time it's very indicative if a guy makes that jump from year 1 to year 2. And as a reminder, most players in year 1 of the NFL are not very good. And so you want to see that jump from year 1 to year 2. And that's usually an indicator that those guys are going to stick in the league beyond the sort of usual 3 or so years that your average NFL player sticks in the league before they ultimately get bounced, right? And especially for the mid-round guys or the late-round guys, like some of the guys we're talking about, you really need that year 2 jump because you're not really guaranteed future opportunities like some of the early round picks. Like, for example, Jeff Okudah being a first-round pick, even if Jeff Okudah plays poorly this year in some scenario, some team is going to give Jeff Okudah another opportunity because he's the first round pick, right? Because those teams universally, for the most part, think very highly of these first round picks. And they're like, well, if he didn't work in Detroit, he didn't work in Atlanta, well, he'll work here in us and we'll give him that opportunity. But when you compare that to, say, a day 3 guy, some of these guys that were taken on day 3 might only be on like 6 teams draft boards. And, if he doesn't make it on one of those teams' opportunities, no guarantee that those other, 5 or so teams are going to be clamoring to get that guy into camp. And certainly the other 26 teams that were, didn't think he was a draft worthy player certainly aren't going to be, looking hard at him to bring them in to the fold and whatnot. So it's important for these late round guys to make that year 2 jump, all that to say. But, with this group, Frank Darby's sort of stands out among this group because he's gotten probably the most praise out of this group. Now, some of that may be owed to the fact that he plays wide receiver, and his success, especially with like one-on-ones and whatnot, is probably a little bit more visible than, say, a trench player like Jalen Mayfield or Ade Ogundeji and whatnot. And of course, with a cornerback like Darren Hall, those one-on-one sessions are kind of geared to make the cornerbacks look worse than they are to make those guys look good. But, it is notable that multiple people have pointed out that, Frank Darby has looked pretty good and had his best summer so far. And we knew going into the summer that Frank Darby had a legit chance to make the 53-man roster as potentially the Falcons' 5th wide receiver, with that spot being sort of completely up for grabs going into training camp. I think I had Josh Ali on my 53-man roster projection, heading into training camp. But, between Frank Darby, Josh Ali, Penny Hart, Zay Malone, Keelan Harris, Slade Bolden, etc. All those guys have as good an opportunity. And you've heard various praise for many of those guys, as I just mentioned on today's episode. So it's not to sit here and say that, Frank Darby's jumped to the head of the pack, but certainly it seems like Frank Darby stock is up at this point in time. And so, I think the joint practices this week, as well as the preseason game against Miami, will be a golden opportunity for Frank Darby, as well as those other receivers, to potentially create some separation right between those guys. I think they're all kind of lumped in together. And if one of those guys emerges out of that Dolphins game or these Dolphins practices as looking especially good, that may help them, wind up making the 53-man roster. When we look at the other guys, Jalen Mayfield, a player that's got a lot of criticism on this podcast over the years, found out that, the move back to right tackle this summer, right? Certainly not something that I look at with a lot of confidence, but it sounds like that was a move made by Jalen Mayfield. The team went to him and asked him, do you want, where are you going to be most comfortable at? He said right tackle, and that's where they moved him. But he did earn some praise from Arthur Smith this past week in practice, right? And as I said, we've been very critical of Jalen Mayfield on this podcast. It's been nothing personal, but you guys know that I tend to try to be as honest as I possibly can when it comes to my opinion on the player, right? That's what I get paid to do, right? But I am actually looking forward and eager to seeing what Jalen Mayfield does look like this summer in the preseason games, where we get a little bit more eyes on him than necessarily you're going to often see in the practices. So that is something I'm looking for. I'm looking forward to eating some crow if that is the case with Jalen Mayfield, and he comes out and does look a lot better at that right tackle position than previously I projected him to look at that position. Because to remind those folks, like, I thought Jalen Mayfield needed to move to guard because I didn't think he had a chance of lasting in the NFL as a tackle, but we'll see. Maybe he proves me wrong on that. Now, you look at a player like Darren Hall, right? He's had some good days according to some observations. He seems to be stuck in the 3rd string cornerback group, Now, one man's setback is another man's opportunity, and that's kind of perfectly describing this situation with Jeff Okudah, right? It sucks for Jeff Okudah, but this is an opportunity for Darren Hall, right? And right now, it seems like he's stuck behind guys like Flowers and Hughes and Armstrong at that cornerback position, in addition to, of course, Terrell and Okudah. But with Okudah out of the way, this is an opportunity for, Darren Hall over the next several weeks that we assume Jeff Okudah is going to be out on lineup to make up some ground. So he can do that in practice. He can do that in the game. So, this is an opportunity for Darren Hall, right? Then you look at Ade Ogundeji. He's also gotten some praise this week, right? The Ikena and the Chukwu injury, certainly, that's one less obstacle in his way to making a bid, not only for the 53-man roster, but potentially the practice squad. So we'll see what he also brings to the table in some of the upcoming games later this summer. So, I still would say it's all uphill battles for all 4 of these guys, but I don't think they're quite dead yet. And I think it's worthwhile to give those guys a little bit of love. And we'll see, when we get into these preseason games and more practices, if we're giving them even more love in the coming days and weeks, right? Because they actually start performing. And maybe we need to talk about, hey, not everybody makes that year 2 jump. Maybe some guys make that year 3 jump, right? That a lot of people thought they would make in year 2. So that may be something to keep an eye on, something to incorporate into future analysis with these guys. But wanted to give those guys their love that they don't often get on this podcast. So that is it, guys. Really appreciate you tuning in for another episode of this illustrious podcast. Continue to check out future episodes. We maybe get to some of your questions on future episodes as well. So if you want to send those in via Twitter, Facebook, you can do so at Locked On Falcons. You can hit up the Discord, the Locked On Falcons Discord, link in the description below. You can also email me at lockedonfalcons@mail.com to provide your feedback on all things illustrious on this daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And in the meantime, guys, make sure you check out the various other shows on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast feed, including Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, as well as ATL Day Ones and Hitting Hard. And of course, make sure you check out the Locked On NFL podcast that is keeping you up to date on all things going on with the other 31 NFL teams each and every day. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.